The stepfather throws the child into the sea to die, and the mother doesn't even lift a finger. But they could never have imagined what the sea would do to him. Robert grew up in a small village by the sea, where life was never easy. His father, Harry, was a fisherman, a kind but strict man. He taught his son to respect nature and the sea, showing him how to set nets properly and telling stories about the stars that help sailors find their way home. However, Robert's happy life came to an end when he turned 10. His father died in a storm while trying to save his boat. It was an unbearable loss for the family. Robert's mother, Mona, was devastated for a long time, but at some point, in order to survive, she decided to remarry. That's when Stephen entered their lives, a rough and harsh man who showed no warmth toward either Mona or her son from the very beginning. Stephen saw Robert as a burden. He couldn't stand the boy's laughter or games and constantly picked on him. To him, the boy was just another mouth to feed, one that required care and food. Robert, on the other hand, tried to please his stepfather. He did all the chores around the house, helped in the garden, and caught fish. But no effort could melt Stephen's icy heart. Mona, blinded by her fear of poverty, tried to ignore Stephen's behavior. She withdrew into herself more and more, avoiding conversations with her son and focusing on household duties. Robert felt that he was losing her love, and that hurt him more than his stepfather's cruelty. One day, returning home earlier than usual, Robert overheard Stephen talking to Mona. "That kid is just in the way. You feed him like some kind of lord, but he's useless." "He's my son, Stephen," Mona replied quietly, but there was no strength or confidence in her voice. "That's your choice. But remember, I'm not here to babysit someone else's child," Stephen said coldly before leaving the room, slamming the door behind him. Something inside Robert broke. The mother he had always seen as his protector could no longer protect him. From that moment on, the boy's life became a struggle. Stephen made things harder for him, forcing him to do unbearable labor, feeding him only scraps, and constantly blaming him for eating up everything they earned. Mona, to avoid conflict, remained silent and interfered less and less. For Robert, his only salvation was the memory of his father. Every night he remembered his lessons, his stories, and the warm voice that gave him strength. But one night, something terrible happened. It was a dark night, one of those where everything seems calm, yet the air feels thick with tension, sending shivers down your spine. Outside, the wind howled like a wild wolf, slamming against the windows as if trying to break in and create chaos. In a modest house by the sea, a 15-year-old boy lay in bed, full of dreams, trying to fall asleep to the sound of creaking floorboards and the roaring wind. But that night, something would happen that would change his life forever. Voices from the next room pulled him out of his thoughts. It was his stepfather and mother. At first, the words were muffled, but Stephen's voice carried a harshness and cruelty that made Robert's blood run cold. His heart pounded like a drum as he carefully got up, making sure not to make the floorboards creak. He pressed his ear to the door and began to hear everything clearly, words he would never forget. "That boy is just in the way," Stephen said, his voice dripping with venom. "We can't afford to keep him anymore. Tomorrow I'll take him to the sea and leave him there. He won't be our problem anymore." Robert's heart stopped. His eyes widened, and his legs barely held him up. "No, he can't be talking about me," he thought, trying to convince himself he had misheard. But then he heard his mother's voice, and his world crumbled. "Do what you want," she replied coldly, as if it didn't concern her at all. There was no hesitation in her voice, as if she were talking about throwing out old furniture or something completely insignificant. Robert bit his lip to keep from screaming. How was this possible? How could his mother, his protector, allow such a thing? His eyes filled with tears, but he couldn't let them fall. Not now. He pressed a hand to his chest, trying to calm his racing heart. For a moment, he couldn't tell if this was a nightmare or reality. "And if someone asks about him," his mother added, as if there were still details to sort out. "No one will," Stephen replied with chilling certainty. "Nobody cares about that boy. It'll be as if he never existed." Robert bit down on his hand to keep from crying out. He wanted to burst in, to confront them, to ask why, but he knew that if they saw him, things would only get worse. Closing his eyes, he searched for strength within himself. And then he heard his father's voice, like a beacon in a storm. "The sea is ruthless, Robert," his father had once told him while teaching him to swim. "But if you respect it, it will give you the strength to survive. Never fear it, son. Learn to use it to your advantage." Robert remembered those days, the lessons, his father's laughter, the way he had always treated him like a man, despite his young age. Those memories ignited a fire inside him. He wouldn't let them win. If they wanted to throw him into the sea, he would show them that he was no victim. That night, as the wind battered the windows and the distant waves roared, a new chapter of his life began. Dawn broke under a gray sky, heavy with salty dampness. The house by the sea looked even gloomier, as if even its walls knew what was about to happen. Robert woke up with a weight on his heart, but his gaze held not only anxiety, but also determination. He knew what awaited him. He had heard every word last night, and though fear gripped him, he decided not to show it. Robert heard someone quietly crying in the kitchen. He got up from bed and cautiously approached the door, listening. It was his mother. Mona sat at the table, pressing a handkerchief to her face, her shoulders trembling with sobs. "Mom, what's wrong? Why are you crying?" Robert stepped into the kitchen, trying to understand what could have upset her so much. Mona straightened abruptly, trying to hide her face. She awkwardly wiped away her tears, forcing a weary smile. "It's nothing, sweetheart. I'm just a little tired," she said, avoiding his gaze. Robert sat across from her, his eyes filled with concern and suspicion. He already knew the truth. He knew his stepfather had planned to get rid of him. But he couldn't understand why his mother remained silent. Why was she agreeing to this monstrous plan? "Are you sure?" he asked quietly, studying her face. "Maybe you can tell me what's really bothering you?" Mona turned away as if afraid her eyes would betray everything. She stood up, walked to the stove, and pretended to be busy with breakfast. "Everything is fine, Robert," she said. Just then, the heavy footsteps of his stepfather echoed through the house. His smile was a mask of false warmth. He approached Robert and leaned in, trying to appear friendly. "Robert, my boy," he said with fake kindness, "I thought we should spend the day together. How about a boat ride? The sea is calm today." Robert looked at him for a moment. Their eyes met, and the boy felt the chill of that deceitful smile. He wanted to scream, to confront his stepfather with questions, but he held back. Swallowing the lump in his throat, he forced an innocent smile and nodded. "Of course, that sounds great," he replied, skillfully concealing the storm raging inside him. Robert smiled at his stepfather, but inside his heart burned with pain and resentment. Silently, he turned and headed to his room to gather his things for the so-called trip. His hands trembled slightly, but he made sure no one noticed. He knew this could be the last time he saw the house he once called home, and the mother he once saw as his protector. Once his things were packed, he stepped into the hallway, where his mother stood waiting by the door. She was nervously twisting the hem of her old robe between her fingers. Her gaze was distant, as if she couldn't bear to look him in the eyes. "Are you ready?" she asked stiffly, trying to sound calm. Robert nodded, hiding the pain behind the gesture. Approaching her, he wrapped his arms around her neck. She froze for a moment, then hesitantly hugged him back. "Mom, you're not crying, are you?" Robert whispered, feeling the slight tremble in her shoulders. Mona quickly pulled away, took a few steps back, and wiped her face. Her smile was just as forced as his stepfather's. "No, of course not. Everything is fine. Just take care of yourself, okay? Stephen wanted to surprise you. It'll be fun." She quickly turned away so he wouldn't see the tears shimmering in her eyes. But Robert saw everything. He saw how her gaze darted, how her hands shook. He knew those tears were her silent goodbye. "All right, Mom, I'll go now," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. She nodded without looking up. Robert lingered for a second at the door, glancing back at her. In that moment, he memorized everything. Her tired expression, her tears, the look in her eyes where love, fear, and guilt blended together. He wanted to ask, "Why didn't you protect me? Why did you let him do this?" But he knew the answers wouldn't change anything. "I love you, Mom," he said quietly. Mona tried to smile, but instead she whispered, "I love you too, son." Robert took a deep breath, gave her one last look, and opened the door. As he stepped outside, he understood that he would probably never cross this threshold again. The walk to the dock felt endless. Familiar houses and trees passed by, but Robert barely noticed them, focused on each step. His stepfather walked beside him, trying to fill the tense silence with conversation. "Look at this, Robert. What a beautiful day," he said with a casual friendliness. "The sea isn't always this calm. A perfect day for a ride. You'll love it. Fresh air, the waves, nothing beats it." He paused for a moment, gesturing toward the horizon. "You know the sea is like life. At first it seems vast and peaceful, but if you get careless, it'll swallow you whole. That's why you have to be strong. You can't relax or it'll take you under. Me? I've always relied on myself. Never asked anyone for anything. Always pulled through on my own. And people can be a burden. If they aren't useful, why keep them around, right?" He cast a quick glance at Robert, watching for a reaction. Robert didn't respond, keeping his face expressionless. Inside, though, every word boiled his blood, but he knew he couldn't reveal that he understood the true meaning behind them. Stephen seemed caught up in his monologue, unaware of Robert's growing tension. "You're still young, Robert. You think people will always take care of you? They won't. Life is a struggle. Everyone's on their own, even family. If they drag you down, they become a burden. Sometimes you have to make tough choices for your own good. It's not easy, but that's reality," he said, his cold, practiced smile returning. "You'll understand when you grow up. The world isn't a fairy tale, and the sooner you realize that, the better. But for now, just listen and learn from me. You're a smart boy, right?" He patted Robert's shoulder. Robert clenched his jaw but forced a weak smile. "Of course, Uncle Stephen," he said softly, each word tasting like poison. Deep inside, he knew that this speech wasn't just words. It was his stepfather's way of justifying his actions. But for Robert, it was proof of what kind of man he truly was. When they finally reached the boat, his stepfather started the engine. The dock faded into the distance, and soon they were far from shore. The hum of the motor and the rocking of the waves filled the silence. Robert stared at the dark water, feeling chills rise on his skin with every meter they moved away from land. When they reached the farthest point, his stepfather cut the engine. A sinister silence settled in, broken only by the whisper of waves. His stepfather turned to face him. There was no more false kindness in his eyes, only something cold and terrifying, as if he enjoyed Robert's vulnerability. "You know why we're here, don't you?" he asked, shattering any last hope for mercy. Robert looked up. His eyes held a mix of courage and defiance. He took a deep breath and answered without hesitation. "Yes, I know what you're planning, but you won't succeed." His stepfather froze for a moment, surprised by the boy's unexpected confidence. But before he could react, Robert suddenly lunged and dove into the water, shattering the tense silence with a loud splash. "Robert!" his stepfather shouted, jumping to his feet. But the boy was already swimming. The water was freezing, each stroke a reminder of the sea's brutal strength. But he knew how to move through it, how to resist its icy grip. His father had taught him to respect the sea, to understand it. Now those lessons had become his greatest weapon. His stepfather remained on the boat, watching in disbelief. How could this boy, whom he had underestimated so many times, find such courage? For a moment the man hesitated, unsure of what to do. Robert glanced back one last time, his eyes full of defiance as if to say, "You will never break me." The sea, which just moments ago had seemed like a trap, had now become Robert's ally. Though the cold seeped into his bones and the water wrapped around him like an icy shroud, he swam with a determination that neither fear nor exhaustion could shatter. He knew he had to conserve his energy and use the knowledge his father had given him. He took a brief pause, letting the hidden flotation devices under his shirt keep him afloat. Robert remembered how, that morning, while his stepfather was rambling on about something pointless, he had secretly tucked the floaters beneath his clothes. That simple item had now become his salvation. Back on the boat, his stepfather snapped out of his daze. He started the engine, and the roar shattered the silence. The boat turned, leaving a trail of white foam behind. Stephen gripped the wheel, but his mind lingered on the moment Robert had jumped into the water. Stupid kid. He just made everything easier for me. Good, less trouble. Now I come out clean. No one can prove anything. If anyone asks, I'll just say he decided to take a swim. Who wouldn't believe me? His mother certainly won't argue. Stephen cast a glance at the horizon, where the foamy trail was already fading. Strange. Something feels off. Could he have known something? The thought barely formed before he dismissed it. What could he possibly know? It's too late anyway. The important thing is, my hands are clean. A smirk curled his lips, but his eyes remained cold. Well, if you chose to make my life easier, thanks for that, he chuckled, silencing any lingering doubt. Now everything will be just fine. I'm in the clear, and that's all that matters. Stephen pushed the throttle, the engine roared louder, and water sprayed in every direction. He never looked back, convinced he had left all his problems behind. Listening to the fading sound of the boat, Robert felt a mix of relief and anger. Relief that the immediate danger was gone, and rage at the man who had been willing to let him die without a second thought. But Robert knew this wasn't over. The cold was closing in around him, the water stretching endlessly in every direction. But he refused to let fear take over. Breath by breath, he fought on. As long as he stayed afloat, his father's words echoed in his mind. The sea is harsh, son, but it is fair. Respect it, and it will not abandon you. Those words became his anchor, filling him with hope and strength. After some time, exhaustion set in. The cold dug deep into his body, his muscles ached, his arms barely obeyed him, and his breathing turned ragged. Every stroke felt impossible. The water around him was ice, draining the last bits of warmth and hope from his body. His lips trembled, his fingers turned numb. Robert fought against panic. He remembered his father's lessons, deep breaths, focus on the rhythm, but the cold and fear clawed at him, making his chest tighten. No, I can't give up, he whispered through clenched teeth. Not now, not like this. He lifted his head, desperate to see anything in the vast darkness. His eyes burned from the salt water, but he forced himself to look. Then, something changed. In the distance, beyond the black abyss, a faint silhouette flickered. Robert blinked, straining to focus. He forced his tired eyes to make out the shape. It was a ship. His heart skipped a beat, then pounded harder. A ship! It's a ship, he whispered, barely believing it. A tiny spark of hope flickered inside him, but the cold wasn't letting go. His strength was slipping away, his arms failing to keep him afloat. Hold on, Robert, hold on. He tried to encourage himself, but his voice was weak. His lips were so frozen, the words barely came out. Every movement hurt, but he forced himself to lift his arm, desperately signaling for help. Hey, over here, he called out, but his voice was swallowed by the crashing waves. One thought consumed his mind. If they don't see me, I won't survive. Again and again, he lifted his arms, ignoring the pain, ignoring the weakness creeping in. Each second felt like an eternity. The cold reached his core, as if trying to steal his soul. He took a deep breath and screamed with everything he had left. Help! I'm here! Robert didn't know if anyone had heard him, but he kept waving, pouring every last bit of energy into the movement. His body weakened, but hope refused to die. I will make it. I won't give up. On the ship's deck, someone noticed movement in the water. A moment later, the ship slowly turned. It's coming closer. Thank God. I'm saved. Relief washed over Robert as he saw figures on the deck. They were fishermen, their faces rugged and weathered by the sea. One of them, a tall man with a thick beard, stared at Robert in shock. That's Harry's boy, one of the fishermen gasped, his eyes wide. For a brief second, they were frozen in disbelief. Then chaos erupted. Get him out of the water, now! They rushed to the railing. One man grabbed a rope, another prepared to pull him up. The tension was thick in the air. Robert, hold on! The red-bearded fisherman shouted, tossing the rope toward him. Don't let go! We've got you! Robert's frozen fingers gripped the rope. Every muscle screamed in pain, but he clung to it with everything he had. Hold tight, kid! Another fisherman urged, pulling the rope. Just don't let go, you hear me? Hurry, he's freezing! Someone else shouted as they hauled the boy in. Robert could barely hold on. His hands were slipping, but the fishermen pulled with such desperation as if they were saving one of their own. "We're not letting you drown, kid! Hang on!" the red-bearded man yelled, yanking the rope harder. Robert couldn't speak. His lips were blue, his breathing ragged, but the look in his eyes, pleading, desperate, drove the fishermen to pull even harder. "Almost there!" one of them shouted, feeling the rope stretch to its limit. With a loud splash of water and shouts of joy, they finally pulled the boy onto the deck. One of the fishermen, an older man with a thick gray beard, immediately threw a blanket over him. "He's alive," he exhaled, sitting down next to Robert to help him warm up. "Kid, can you hear us?" Robert struggled to lift his gaze. His lips trembled, but in his eyes there was a spark of life. "What happened, kid?" "Why were you alone at sea?" asked one of the fishermen, a tall man with scars on his arms. Robert found the strength to respond with difficulty. His voice shook, but he told them everything. About what he had heard that night, about his stepfather's plans, about his mother's betrayal. Every word was like a hammer blow to the fisherman, who had known and respected his father. "That scoundrel," one of the fishermen muttered, clenching his fists. "How could he? Harry was a good man, and this boy is his blood." Robert lifted his head, his eyes full of determination. "I don't want to go back there," he said firmly. "My father always said the sea was his home. I want it to be my home too." The men exchanged glances. In Robert's eyes they saw a rare kind of strength, even for adults. One of them, the bearded man, placed a hand on his shoulder. "All right, Robert," he said. "From now on, this ship is your home. We'll be your family and we'll teach you everything we know. You're safe here." Robert felt warmth and hope fill his heart. The men helped him up, dried him off, and gave him hot tea and fish soup. For the first time in months, he felt safe on the deck of the fishing boat. The sea, which had once seemed hostile, had now become his refuge. A year passed. Life on the ship became a new chapter for Robert. Every day he learned something new: how to read the stars, understand the wind and currents, set nets, and haul in the catch. The fishermen, rough at first glance, treated him with warmth and respect. They saw his father's spirit in him, a man known for his courage and honesty. Robert gave it his all. He worked alongside the grown men, never complaining about exhaustion or hard labor. Over time, he became part of the crew, and the men started calling him our boy. Under the guidance of his mentor, Winston, the most experienced fisherman, Robert grew not only physically, but also mentally. His soul became stronger, and his heart learned to forgive. One evening, as he sat on the stern watching the sunset, Robert remembered his father's words. His deep, warm voice seemed to echo beside him. "If you ever need a safe place, go to the cave by the bay. Never tell anyone about it, not even your mother." Those words, heard years ago, now resurfaced in his mind with striking clarity. Why had his father told him about the cave? What had he wanted to leave there? The next day, Robert shared his memory with Winston. The fisherman rubbed his gray beard, thinking. "The cave by the bay, yeah, I know that place," and he said, "not many people go there. They say bats live in it, and some believe the place is cursed. Are you sure you want to go?" "I'm sure," Robert answered firmly. "If it was important to my father, then it's important to me." Winston studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, kid, we'll go at dawn." At sunrise, they loaded a small rowing boat with some food and water and set off for the bay. The journey was quiet, the water gently splashing under the oars, seagulls crying overhead. Robert felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. What would he find in the cave? What had his father wanted him to see? When they reached the bay, Robert was awestruck by its beauty. Tall cliffs surrounded the place as if shielding it from the outside world. The water was a brilliant blue, so clear it seemed to glow. In the farthest corner of the bay, a dark, ominous entrance loomed. The cave. "There it is," Winston said, pointing with his oar. "Be careful. There's always something unexpected in places like this." Robert nodded silently, jumped out of the boat, and walked toward the cave. Its entrance was massive, and from deep inside came a faint noise, like wind or the rustling of wings. The air turned damp and cool, and the walls glistened with tiny droplets of water. He moved cautiously, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. Then he saw it. Near the far wall, water had formed a small, shimmering pool. Robert stepped closer. The water was so clear he could see the bottom. But then he noticed something strange. A dark shape, like a box, resting beneath the surface. His heart pounded. Could this be what his father had left behind? Quickly, Robert stripped down to his shirt and trousers and dove into the water. The cold pierced him, but he didn't stop. Swimming closer, he saw that it was indeed a wooden chest, covered in seaweed, wedged between the rocks. With effort, he pried it loose and surfaced. Shivering, he climbed onto the rocks and set the chest down. Its surface was carved with intricate patterns, like those from ancient times. With a deep breath, Robert opened it. Pearl necklaces, gold coins, antique jewelry. Everything looked as if it had been hidden for decades. His eyes filled with tears. He didn't know exactly what message his father had left for him, but he understood one thing. This was a gift, a reminder of his love, his belief in his son. Robert stared at the contents of the chest, trying to grasp their meaning. Every pearl, every coin, every carved ornament told a story, one his father had left behind just for him. In that moment, he felt a connection not just to his father, but also to the sea itself, which had become a part of his life. Winston, standing at the cave entrance, had been watching. When Robert finally looked up and met his gaze, Winston slowly walked over. "This is your legacy, kid," he said, placing a hand on Robert's shoulder. "You have to decide what to do with it." Robert took a deep breath of the salty cave air and nodded. "I know what to do," he said quietly. They returned to the boat, and Robert held the chest on his lap as if it were something fragile. On the way back, Winston said nothing, understanding that the boy needed time to process everything. Days passed. Robert decided to show his discovery to a local antiquities expert, an elderly man with sharp eyes known for his honesty. The man examined each item carefully, studying every coin and pearl under a magnifying glass. "This isn't just treasure, boy," he finally said, removing his glasses. "This is history. Every piece here is incredibly valuable. These coins date back to ancient times, possibly from shipwrecks lost in these waters. These pearls, exceptionally rare, from seas that no longer exist. And these ornaments? Each one is worth a fortune." Robert listened in silence, feeling a deep sense of pride. His father had left him more than just wealth. He had given him an opportunity to build a new life. "And what do you plan to do with it?" the expert asked, studying him closely. "I want to use it to start something of my own," Robert answered confidently. "Something connected to the sea. This is my life." Years later, Robert became the owner of a fishing company. He not only bought several modern boats, but also built a seafood processing plant, providing jobs for dozens of local people. His business became a symbol of revival for the entire village. By his side were always his father's friends, the very fishermen who had once saved him. He treated them like family, and in return they took pride in being part of his success. "Your father would be proud of you, kid," Winston told him one day as they supervised a boat's catch. "It's all thanks to him," Robert replied, "and thanks to you." Despite his success, Robert remained humble and kind. He lived in a house near the sea, where every morning he greeted the sunrise, listening to the sound of the waves. That house became his refuge, a symbol of his new life. But the past had not disappeared. Robert knew there was still one shadow he had to dispel: his mother, the woman who had once betrayed him. One day he decided to find her. After weeks of searching, he learned that she was living in a small seaside village, far from their old home. When Robert knocked on her door, he felt his heart pounding in his chest. The door opened, and an elderly woman with a weary face appeared on the threshold. The moment she saw him, she froze, as if staring at a ghost. "Robert," she whispered, her voice trembling as if every letter cut her throat. Her hands shook, and her face turned pale, as though all the life had drained from it. "It's you! It's really you!" She barely exhaled, taking an uncertain step forward, as if afraid he would disappear the moment she blinked. Robert stood before her, wet and exhausted. His clothes were still soaked from the rain, his face gaunt, but in his eyes burned a firm resolve. He remained silent, as if testing her, not ready to reveal his emotions just yet. I thought, her voice broke, and she covered her mouth with her hand to stifle a sob. I thought I'd never see you again, she choked out before rushing toward Robert, wrapping her arms around him as if trying to make sure he was real, that this wasn't a dream. Her fingers clung to his shoulders and tears streamed down her cheeks. I'm sorry, she sobbed, her voice filled with pain and despair. Please forgive me. I I didn't know what to do. I was, I, Her words were mixed with sobs, each one escaping with difficulty, as if she were trying to squeeze out all the guilt that had weighed on her for so long. Robert stood motionless, allowing her to hold him, but his gaze remained cold, almost distant. You thought I drowned, didn't you? He finally said, his voice quiet but striking like a thunderclap. His mother froze, realizing that he knew. He knew everything. Her grip weakened, and she slowly let go, stepping back. Robert! Her voice was barely audible, as if she couldn't find the words. I I wanted... You wanted to abandon me, Robert cut her off, staring straight into her eyes. You wanted to get rid of me, like an unwanted thing. His words cut through her heart, making her shudder. She tried to say something, but her throat tightened, refusing to let out a single sound. Covering her face with her hands, she began to cry again, but Robert didn't move. Why did you do it? His voice was filled with pain and bitterness. Why? I was your son. Is this how mothers act? She lowered her hands, looking at him with tear-filled eyes. I was a coward, Robert. I was afraid of him. I thought that if I agreed, he would spare me. But I was wrong. Every day I cursed myself for what I did. Robert listened without interrupting. There was no hatred in his eyes, only sorrow. I can't forgive you, he said, but I can let go of the past. Live your life however you want, but you will no longer be a part of mine. Robert watched his mother as tears rolled down her face, her words sounding like helpless excuses. He was about to leave, but something held him in place. Holding back his emotions, he asked a question that suddenly came to his mind. Where is Stephen? He said coldly, not even trying to hide his disgust. His mother looked up at him, her face twisted with pain, mixed with a strange sense of relief. Stephen, she whispered, as if afraid to say his name out loud. He's gone. Robert frowned, his gaze turning sharp. What do you mean, gone? He asked, studying her expression. She averted her eyes and lowered her hands. It seemed like the memories pained her deeply. It happened a few months ago, she began quietly. He went fishing, as usual. There was a storm, a strong one. No one saw exactly what happened, but his boat was found overturned near the shore. They never found his body. Robert listened in silence, his heart clenched, not from pity but from the realization of how fate had dealt with this man. So the sea took him, he muttered more to himself than to her. It took him just like he wanted it to take me. His mother sobbed, covering her face with her hands. I didn't want this, she whispered, but I guess we all have to pay for our actions. Robert let out a bitter chuckle, but his eyes remained cold. Looks like the sea is fairer than both of you, he said. It took the one who deserved it the most. His mother gasped as if his words had stabbed her deeper than any knife. But Robert felt no pity. He simply turned toward the door and, without looking back, said over his shoulder, Live with your guilt, mother. You're alone now, and I think that's your real punishment. With that, he left, leaving her to cry alone, surrounded by the silence that had now become her only companion. Robert returned to the sea, the place that had always been his refuge. It was not just his ally, but a reminder that he had survived it all. From that moment on, he lived with dignity, honoring the memory of his father and those who had helped him survive. Every morning he woke up early to greet the sunrise and feel the cool ocean breeze on his face. His success became an inspiration to others, and many villagers began to look up to him, not just as a wealthy man, but as a strong leader. One day, as he sat on the balcony of his home, watching the waves, he heard the laughter of children. Looking down, he saw the village kids playing in the sand. It reminded him of his own childhood, when he was just a carefree boy running along the shore with his friends. How quickly things change, he murmured to himself. These thoughts often returned to him. He knew the past had left its mark on him, but now he saw life differently. For Robert, his story was not just about survival, it was about changing his destiny. Thank you for listening to this story until the end. Don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to my channel, and share this video with your friends and loved ones. Your support motivates us to keep working on new stories every day. Don't miss the next incredible story that's about to appear on your screen. We are truly grateful to have you with us. In the description below, you can find a catalog of all our stories. See you soon.